QR code or from the bit.ly. And then just to keep you on track for the next 1 hour, we'll be speaking with Peter ahead of a break, and then returning after the break to speak with Tala Muhammad about the lived experience of racism and racial discrimination in Hong Kong. We do have the Miro board. Please do post your thoughts and ideas. Over the lunch break, we will update that with some insights that we take away through the day. And I encourage you, it's a great way for us to make sure that we understand where your thinking is going around the topic and where we need to help support you into the future. So without further ado, that first session, we really wanted to say that there's a challenge there, a challenge for you to step into, and that in doing so, we needed to get our heads around what is a working definition for us to consider with race and racism, if race in itself isn't actually an identifiable attribute as identifiable as it has typically been in the West. So to help us with that conversation, I'd like to introduce Peter Mousaferiadis, the CEO of Cultural Infusion. Peter has spent over 3 decades working in cultural and creative industries, founding Cultural Infusion in 2002, with the unique proposition, I think, being a business that builds global harmony through intercultural interaction via education and the arts. Right? It's if you read Peter's bio in our notes, you will find it's quite an interesting background he has, reaching over 350,000 students each year in diversity education through his program Discovering Diversity. In the past, Peter has worked on productions with the Parliament of World Religions, United Nations, along with producing 9 Australia Day concerts. That latter bit may not have great significance outside of Australia, but the fact that he's done 9 and they are big national events, recognition events, it's pretty impressive nonetheless. He's a winner of numerous international awards in interculturalism, including the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Intercultural Innovation Award. It'd be nice if they had an acronym for that, because that's a long one. And, there is, okay. And he's recognised for producing a winning slogan, interestingly enough, diversified we grow, for I guess it's for that National Alliance campaign of do one thing for diversity. Interestingly, and this is what caught my eye about Peter, is back in 2019, after 5 years of research, he launched the Diversity Atlas, a data analytics tool to provide comprehensive insights into the extent and type of cultural and demographic dimensions of diversity. And for me, while we're not going to talk about Peter's product per se, the insights that created it are what we're talking about in understanding race and racism. And that underpinning, I think, is really interesting because it takes data sets from census, among other things, and allows us to see how that maps our own talent within an organization. So really getting down to that community level of representation rather than that talent pool level where many of us tend to operate. And then just lastly, just to identify that, Peter's a co-chair of the Lahore International Conference on Culture, a global trustee of United Religions Initiative, a Salzburg Global Fellow, and a member of the Asia Peace Innovators Forum, and was issued a Peace Ambassador Award from the Centre of Peace Studies in Sri Lanka. I think it's safe to say Peter has a fairly eclectic background. And if I'm not mistaken, Peter, didn't you train to be an orchestral conductor? And how is it you come to be here talking to us about diversity?
Well, is it a long story or is it just one story? I was actually tossing up whether to become a theologian initially, and I went to university and majored in religious studies and Koine Greek, which was the language that came about as a result of Alexander's expansion into Central and South Asia. So Koine Greek came about, and then the New Testament was written in that language, but the arts got the better of me. So I ended up studying clarinet at the Victorian College of the Arts here in Melbourne. And then I went overseas and studied conducting. I spent about 4 years studying in Czechoslovakia, and I was there during the transition. Spent some time at the Accademia Musicale Chigiana in Siena, some time in Greece, and I did a short stint in the Midwest in Indiana, South Bend, Indiana, where Notre Dame University is based. And when I returned to Australia, I started to work as a conductor, composer. I was being called upon by a whole range of different organisations because of the organisational skills that I developed to begin to work in representing artists from different backgrounds. I put together an orchestra mainly comprising of musicians who'd come to Australia from the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and I developed all these skills. And I suppose along the way I was beginning to develop these competencies of how to work, with the other. Before too long, I was being called upon to direct and produce shows. I produced 9 Australia Day concerts in total. I've produced and directed more than 40 opening and closing ceremonies for a range of international events. 2002 came along and I developed cultural infusion, I suppose, for a range of different reasons. And this was in tandem to, in parallel to working as a conductor. I saw my whole parents' generation come to Australia, and I felt there was really nothing being done to really conserve and, revitalise the traditions that they were connected to through an intercultural setting. I recognise that, whilst the events were a great way of celebrating diversity, they didn't go as far as education would. And I really wanted to create this, organisation that would start to really use market forces to motivate behavioural change and begin to really deal with the rise of ethnic and race-based discrimination. In Australia, I found that we weren't doing enough also to recognise the value, the cultural diversity, which is really humanity's greatest asset, to draw upon it as a way of being able to sort of foster innovation, growth, education, and also recognise and build intercultural understanding as this core value and key competency of what it means to be a global citizen. And lastly, it was also a way of me being able to maintain a workforce, because with all the big events I was doing, you would sort of upscale and downsize. So I thought, well, I need to maintain a workforce throughout the year. So the education program also allowed me to do that. And within a real short period of time, we were delivering programs to more than 350,000 students annually. And I think in total, we've delivered about 35,000 programs over the last 2 decades. So I suppose all along, Andrew, there was this common thread of celebrating diversity and bringing people together from different perspectives and trying to really build this idea of how can we build harmony through intercultural action. But in 2014, my CTO came along to me, Reza Mayini, and he goes, forever in a day, you're always talking about cultural diversity and you talk about diversity, but I'm a metrics person. I want to understand what it means. What does this look like? And we quickly realized that cultural diversity had been poorly defined, it had been analytically neglected, and it was also in need of robust understanding. And it was at that point where we conducted 300 literature reviews and really began to sort of disaggregate this notion of cultural diversity into a range of pillars. Yeah.
And so obviously we've got this grand challenge of race and racism aren't a neat fit. What have you observed are the critical elements to understanding race and racism and, with that harmony lens?
Yeah, I think it's about trying to understand what the opposite is to what we're talking about. And we need to begin to try to understand the drivers of racism and understand where racism actually comes from and how it's rooted in fear. and this notion of fear, where did that come from? It's a neurobiological mechanism that has evolved in human beings over the past 200,000 years. It's rooted in tribalism, the need for us to congregate and group with those we perceive as like us is really important. This makes us who are not like us our enemies by default. This is instinctive, but how can we start to overcome that? And I suppose in many ways what we've seen since 2007 is this rise of big data and social media driving misinformation and really exploiting this mechanism called fear. And I think what we've seen in maybe the last 15 years is this strong connection between the rise of social media, in 2007, and the decline in peace across the globe. And I'll talk about that later. But I'll put the question to all the participants today. If we want to remove racism, which is intrinsically connected to fear, then do we need to wait for biological evolution? I'm not too sure. And I've been thinking about this deeply, especially over the weekend leading up to this talk. I really don't think we do enough to understand diversity, and I think this is part of the challenge. Back in 2014, when Reza came to me, we disaggregated cultural diversity into these 4 pillars, and we disaggregated it into country of birth. So we developed our own methodology for that, and we used the UN database of nations and the dependent territories and extended that to include a few other countries. We built a database of about 8,500 religions and worldviews, and as a way of being able to make sense of all living things around us. We built this database of 11,500 speech communities, and we began to look at how these speech communities relate to each other, whether they be like a speech community or a language or a dialect. And last but not least, we started to look at ethnicity and how that intersects with all these other dimensions of diversity. Well, not only ethnicity, but also ancestral heritage, also cultures that people are aligned to, and subgroups. And we have a database of 8,500. But what we really started to do was really understand this concept of diversity. And diversity really simply put means difference. So how can we start to apply algorithms to this? And this is what Reza said. Pete, we can develop mathematical formulas and a whole range of algorithms, so we can look at an organization today and look at it tomorrow, and then start to look at the 3 key metrics. And let me talk about those 3 key metrics, because they're really important in how they play out. The first metric is variety, and that is the balance that describes sort of the absence of homogeneity. So you might have, let's say, 4 Portuguese people in one room, and in another room you've got 2 Portuguese and 2 Italians. So you've got greater variety of languages in that room. So we can create an algorithm. The second metric is balance, and balance looks at the distribution of what we're trying to measure across an organization. So a lot of organizations might say they're really diverse, but when you start to look at the diversity within the organization, the further north you go, they tend to be, especially in Australia, a lot whiter, and virtually very little diversity and reflective of the whole of the organization, let alone the community that they're serving. And then the last metric is this metric of disparity, or the dissimilarity of what we're trying to look at. So think of a group now which has got 1 Portuguese, 1 Italian, and 1 French-speaking person. And in another group, you've got a Portuguese, an Arabic, and Chinese-speaking person. But the diversity in that second group is going to be much greater. And we know that one's ethno-linguistic background, influences cognitive processes. It shapes the way we think. It shapes the way we relate to each other. I feel like I'm, preaching to the converted here, but that's also a really, really important metric of diversity. So what we've done with our database, we've been able to really look at the first couple of metrics, and we're now looking at the third metric, and that's going to take us probably the better part of maybe 7-8 years to really begin to look at the relationship of one language to the next. But we've started that process, and we're going to start to look at really applying algorithms to that. But if I can just talk a little bit longer, I've spent the better part of maybe 9 years traveling, living out of a suitcase over the past 2.5 decades. And I really begin to sort of connect with this notion of, culture, and began to really realize that knowledge becomes a diversification of, ideas, and that intercultural dialogue really becomes the premise for and the driver for achieving innovation. So I realized that wherever I went, all buildings, all objects really reinforce that we're connected, and that culture is based on this confluence of ideas, and the importance of knowing the other, and how that can give humanity so much. But I'm not saying that culture is this mighty force. I know it's a double-edged sword, but UNESCO has come out saying that culture is a driver of sustainable development. It's an eradicator of poverty. It can be used as quality education. It can be key to building peaceful and cohesive communities. But last but not least of all, it's, as I stated above, it's also this great driver of innovation. There is no better way to innovate and solve our challenges by bringing diverse perspectives together. And that was why I coined the phrase "diversified we grow" in 2013. And I had the opportunity to present it to a whole lot of heads of state and 80 directors of ministries of culture from across the globe at the World Forum on Intercultural Dialogue in Azerbaijan. When I coined that phrase, I wasn't just thinking about this creating this great feeling. I was thinking about the numerical system we have today, and how that came about as a result of this convergence of Arabic, Hindu, Persian, and Hellenic thought to give us a system that we're still using today. I was beginning to think of the contribution of First Nations cultures across the globe, and how much they've given to societies, through the contribution of medicines. I was thinking of the bionic eye, and how that's been the convergence of many different disciplines coming together from all over the world to give something to humanity, which would have seemed unimaginable, 3 decades ago. So, but coming back to this word culture, it is a problematic term, and the meaning does differ depending on where you are. But I think we can say that culture is the ways in which a particular group of people live. It includes shared knowledge, values, customs, and includes physical objects. So when we hear the word culture, what are we referring to? Is it this overarching culture of a nation? Are we referring to this ethno-linguistic religious culture of a group or an individual? Are we referring to organizational workplace culture, which is, the systems and behaviors and values that an organization's employees are required to subscribe to? Culture is overarching and underpinning. Every society has a culture. It has a way of thinking, a way of behaving. It has social norms. All these guide society. So if you want to have social change, then I think we really need to recognize that, social change is embedded in cultural change. And I really want to stress that point. We talk about social enterprises and having impact on societies. But how do we do that if we don't realize that if you really want to have social impact, you need to have cultural impact first? And I think this is something for the DIAN network to think about, and how we do business as well. We're out there to really create social impact, but start to think of this notion of how are you using market forces to really motivate behavioral change. And lastly, I just want to point out that, according to the UN, 75% of all conflict that we have in the world has a cultural dimension. And according to the Global Peace Index, which was established by an Australian philanthropist, Stephen Killalay, he said that, the cost of conflict equates to, this 14% of the world's GDP. So in terms of dollars, we're talking about $10 trillion is spent every year dealing with conflict, which has a cultural dimension. So the question to all of you is, why are we not re-envisioning societies that put culture, that put diversity, that put our greatest asset, cultural diversity, at the heart of all education, development, and progress? The lifeblood of culture is confluence. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. But bringing it back to the specific we have, which is that race piece and how we can have the dialogue. There are some shortcomings to talking about race and racism in our geographies. What have you observed about that, and how have you seen an alternative way of responding to that race? Is there a better definition?
Yeah, I think what we need to do is probably unpack what we mean by race and also racism. So race is the least important aspect in determining character, yet it is the most significant factor in how we are often perceived. Why? Because of false meaning we ascribe to race. Race is not genetic, and I'm going to talk to that in a moment. Research has found that people in Africa have probably less in common with one another than what an Asian and a European person have. Okay? So let me repeat that. On average, two individuals in Africa are more genetically dissimilar from each other than either one of them is from an individual in Europe or Asia. And current science tells us that we share a common ancestry and that all humans are 99.99% alike. It's this 0.01% difference which we seem to focus on. It's this variation that exists in all humans. It really has more to do with geographical and evolutionary processes. So if you think of West Africans or Turkish people, or Italians, or even my ethnicity, which I'm connected to, Greek people, we tend to have a greater resistance to malaria. I think something like 20% of Greek people have this resistance to malaria, and they've built that up over time. And that's come about because of this exposure. So, I think we need to be really clear that genetic variation in human beings is really part of this amazingly complex result of evolution and mustn't ever be reduced to race. Similarly, race, is real. It just isn't genetic. It's culturally created phenomenon. Race is this pure socio-political construction, which has got powerful consequences. And we see how this is played out and how it's been played out for thousands of years. It's this assertion of human racial difference, which is really based in prejudice and not fact. So racism is not a prejudice against humans of different races, because there are no different human races. Rather, racism is the process whereby certain characteristics like religion, skin color, size, and even cultural practices are taken as being some sort of a sign of an essential biological difference. So if we start to unpack what we mean by this notion of race, it really is a social construct wherein one group of people can dominate another group of people. It is probably best to understand racism by recognizing the drivers, and the key drivers of racism are fear and ignorance, but also how they play out geopolitically and also within organizations, structurally and systemically. Every country in the world offers natural privilege to those who are connected to the hegemony. They do. I've seen this throughout my travels, not because it's done intentionally, but probably because these people have set up these systems and these structures that certain types of people connected with them better than others. So we need to understand, I think, the anthropological dimension to this and the importance of building intercultural competence is a core value and this key competency of what it means to be a human being today, and in particular, a global citizen. So on one hand, we have this concept of racism, and then on the other hand, we have this concept of race. Race was primarily constructed so that one group of people, like I mentioned earlier on, wanted to exert influence over another group. But in our organization, we've tried to really unpack and understand these concepts. We've built this data platform, a data analytics platform, which is driven by this data equity model, which makes sure that no one is left out. we don't use the word race, but we know it's important because we know people discriminated against because of their race. So we use this SID, which is this self-identification, and we call it appearance, because we recognize that race is a overloaded term. So in the context of workplaces, I think it's really important that we start to, and we've seen this shift from DI to DEI. And, this equity framing brings us firmly into space of, anti-racism, power and safety. I think we need to start to take these equitable frameworks and ultimately recognize that we don't all start from the same place, not only socially, but also culturally. The case in point is that blanket strategies don't work. And this is why a nuanced approach, and an approach where we can start to really dissect cultural diversity and identity and look at all the different aspects and have databases which really look at every single aspect. And that's why ethnicity becomes vital in how we build equitable spaces and representative spaces. So, the question then becomes, how do you do this? How do you take a nuanced approach that can play to the range of not only socio, but also the range of cultural determinants?
So does that lead us to a different definition? If we were looking at the way you see the world, is it, how do you roll all those things up? Is there a statement to it? Is that ethnicity? Is it what's the lens that you then talk about race, if we don't want to get that into that minutia of bias?
So what we do is we look at cultural diversity, and we've disaggregated that into those 4 pillars, because we recognize country of birth is important, but we know that country of birth doesn't define your ethnicity. Maybe after a few generations, it might, but we recognize this, having inclusive data sets around religion, around ethnicity, ancestral heritages, languages that people speak, are really vitally important, that allows organizations to take this strategic and this nuanced approach, because at the moment, the extent of what we're seeing really isn't understood because there aren't any data sets out there.
So for the way you look at Asia, does it change at all, or is it exactly the same? Are there any other nuances that you layer in for us to be, considering this?
Yeah, I think we need to. Thanks, an excellent question, Andrew. And I think the danger that we're seeing across the globe, and I think this is a really great opportunity now for Asia to take a lead. We're seeing this conflation of race with other aspects of identity. You see it in the US Census, where they've got basically 5 categories for people to choose: white, Black or African American, American Indian or Native Alaskan, Asian, or you may be Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. That's it. So we've seen this conflation of race and ethnicity, and what this is doing is, and the similar thing happens in the UK, where they've got 4 different categories of white. They've got Black, African, Caribbean, Black, British, mixed or multiple ethnic groups. So a lot of people are really beginning to feel left out. But what we're seeing is that when you start to conflate, and there's been a lot of studies done out there, that when you conflate race with ethnicity, it perpetuates inequality, poverty, and division. It doesn't allow organizations to really understand what's going on, because you're offering these sort of blanket strategies. So I think Asia has an excellent opportunity to begin to lead the way. I also want to say that what Encounter isn't racist. And what I mean by this is that whenever we approach a setting, we're approaching it solely by our values and standards of our own, culture. We use our culture as this reference and central point in assessing other cultures rather than trying to see them from another viewpoint. This is known as ethnocentrism, ethno-valuism, whatever you want to call it. The question now becomes, how do we create new forms of communication which start to synthesize these incommensurable cultural differences. So, and Asia, there's been a long history. If you go to North-South Asia and you go to the Museum of Lahore, one of the great museums of the world, you see the first bilingual coin in the world dating back 2,000 years. What does that tell you about embracing the other, setting up inclusive settings? So I really think that Asia can start to draw upon its history and use that and go, well, we don't need to look too far. The answers sometimes lie in the past. But I also want to talk about the danger of beginning to reduce identity into these these constructs of white and other, white and people of color. And I get that why identity politics, we saw this emergence of it soon after the civil rights movement in the US, because it was all about how many groups were being left out socially. But I think there's a strong danger that if Asia begins to adopt a similar approach, then it will end up with a lot of the similar issues that the US, the UK, and to some extent what's starting to emerge in Australia is this real division. It's this real fracture in society. It's about us and them, rather than starting to focus on how can we start to create new settings based on shared values and really recognize everyone's identity, and in particular their cultural identity.
Thanks, Peter. And something that Peter Sargent, I think, brought up in his introduction, or else it's elsewhere in our conversations, was sort of a bit of a rise of a new nationalism in the COVID era. And I was just triggered by when you described African American. Is that attachment to a nationalism, like Asian American, is the way that it's looked at in the US as the category. It's not your ethnicity, it's just purely upon that sense of point of origin, but it's attached to a sort of a national identity. Is there an inherent risk in that? Is that the same as you just described?
Well, no, I think that's a little bit different, because African American was sort of this distinctive culture which was centered around, the arts, language, lingo, and a whole range of other aspects of identity, which sort of people came together and developed, this unique culture, which was probably somewhat slightly different to this overarching American culture that was developed. So, a culture is ever changing. It's dynamic. It needs to be, reinventing itself. The lifeblood of culture is confluence. So forever and a day, it's going to be absorbing influences, from everywhere. But I think what we also need to recognize is that by beginning to focus on taking a deeper dive and starting to focus on ethnicity, we're really beginning to draw on the richness that cultural diversity can to bring to organizations. There's a myriad of studies out there by the Deloitte's, McKinsey's, Forbes, Global Human Capital, and they talk about the value of what diversity can bring to societies. It's 6 times more likely to be innovative if you're more diverse, 6 times more likely to anticipate change and respond effectively, 35% more likely to perform better and improved return on investment, 67% of job seekers view a diverse workforce as important, 83% of millennials report being actively engaged in inclusive workplaces, 87% of better decision, 87% better decision making is made when you've got diverse teams. So, diversity is the right thing to do, and it's good for business. So if you're just going to focus on white and you're just going to focus on people of color, then you're going to miss out on all these other possibilities. But more importantly, really beginning to focus on the value that representation brings to an organization. And this is something we built into our tool, this notion of mutuality, and we've developed this mutuality index, which looks at to what extent is an organization representative and reflective of the community it's serving. And the genesis for this idea was the law of requisitability, which is one of the principles of thermodynamics, which states that for any system to remain vibrant and relevant, it needs to be mirroring and adapting to its environment. And if it's not, it will eventually create tension and possibly be at risk. So I think representation will make you take an intersectional lens. And by making you take an intersectional lens, it will eventually make you become more diverse. And from there, you're able to develop a whole range of inclusive and equitable strategies that can follow on from that. Because how do you do that if you don't have data?
So if a country is a dynamic culture, and across the Asia region, we have very many different cultures within those many countries, what's the implication for us to defining ethnicity? Is it still just the same characteristics? Do we need to look at that national element at all? How do we need to just stay sharp to the nuances?
Well, I think societies need to be careful not to try to impose a way of how people should understand themselves, because if you do that, resentment will build. And there's been a lot of studies around that. So I think the best thing that Asia can do now is really begin to embrace its diversity. And this is not a change that's going to happen overnight. It's got to be reflecting this change, because the changes are happening around us all the time. So how do you start to put maybe targets in place that go, okay, for example, in Australia, we know that 3% of our population identifies as being First Nations. Yet many organisations, and especially like in mining towns where there's a lot of Indigenous people, you have less than 0.01% of women that are employed in those communities being of Indigenous background. Why aren't there more? So how can governments start to go, we're going to develop a long-term strategy over maybe 10-year period to get that to 1%, and then maybe just start to build up representation? And how do we start to work with our communities to start to build capacity in those communities through education programs, and really take an active role and really be seen as socially responsible corporate citizens that are really interested in the communities? Because if you don't, there's always going to be this disconnect. So I think ethnicity is a really important part. Every nation is going to have its overarching ethnicity, and many individuals are going to identify with more than one ethnicity. Some will identify with 3 or 4. And what we've done with our data analytics platform, Diversity Atlas, is we allow for the individual to self-identify and maybe select up to 4 religions or 4 ethnicities and up to 20 languages. You can only achieve and win by embracing diversity, but more importantly, understanding who your workforce is and knowing then how to use that.
Thanks, Peter. And I'm tempted to tune into a couple of the questions and comments that have been in the chat there. But if I was to try and pot that you've described, is as we're talking about data and trying to understand our workforces, there is an inherent risk that we try and simplify and codify to the point of irrelevance. If we're really going to go out and see people for who they are and have people be recognised, it sounds like we need to have a fairly broad brush approach, almost like you tell us what you think you are, rather than us try and say, here are the boxes that we've got for you to choose from.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not going to be able to tell anyone what they're not. And like I mentioned earlier on, this will create resentment. You need buy-in, and I think there needs to be the opportunity for this SID concept, this self-identification. And what we've noticed with deploying our tool, across Asia, we're deploying it across Europe and Africa at the moment with a multinational company which has 1.6 million employees. That people really enjoy going on this discovery. It creates a discussion. People go, well, I'm not too sure what my ancestral heritage is. I want to learn a little bit more about it. But it starts to open up the conversation, and then people start to feel valued, and they go, well, you know what? There are aspects of my identity now which are being valued. And I think, organizations, businesses, when they have this information, they go, you know what, 8% of our workforce identify with Islam, for example. You have Ramadan at the moment. We can maybe organize floating days. How can we create spaces where you can play? How can we, express allyship? So when you start to do that, you will get buy-in like you've never seen before from, your workforce.
But it's going to be a dynamic set. Every time the culture changes,
That's right.
every time the workforce changes, you're going to have to be open to finding new attributes. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
those things won't be seen in your audience, be that the community audience or the representative workplace audience.
100% correct. And that's because our environments are changing all the time around us for a whole range of reasons. People being, disconnected from their homelands, population, demographics are changing, people moving from one part of the world, students are moving from one part of the world, companies are expanding, they need to have workforces that might be beginning to reflect, the communities that they're operating in. And yes, it's an ongoing process. It's not a process that just goes, we're going to do this once. You need to be doing it again and again and again. And so organizations we're working with are beginning to, deploy, this data analytics approach to understand their workforces on an annual basis. And what they're finding is that those that didn't participate the first time or didn't want to answer certain questions are becoming more forthcoming the second time around. So I think we have a lot to gain here. And I know there's a danger around how, this type of data can be weaponized, but what economic austerities have taught us is that during these times of economic austerity, knowing the other is really important, because when you know the other, you can build strong bonds. And Europe now is really suffering because they introduced these laws back in, I think it was 1978, around collecting data around certain aspects of identity, and it wasn't allowed. And now you have places like France, and they don't understand who they are, and they've got a whole range of issues which are emerging on a daily basis. So I think, coming back to Asia once again, this is a great opportunity where they can go, you know what, we have more to gain by knowing who the other is than not knowing who the other is.
Thanks very much, Peter. So fear, intersectionality, letting people know that you can see them seem to be the messages in amongst all of that. I'd like to open the floor then to any questions or observations people would like to draw upon, whether it's to test Peter out and some of his thoughts, or even just to share a perspective, because I see many perspectives popping up there in the chat box. Good. Anyone?
Yes, there's a question around by Lauren Fikes. I can see here, what are the 4 disaggregated pillars? Yes, it's religion, languages, ethnicity, and country of origin. They're the sort of the broad pillars, and then there are sub pillars within those. So what we've done is we've developed what we describe as this database of humanity, and it's dynamic. We've democratized this data, so every time we use it, we're constantly updating it. So we have a linguist, an anthropologist that works with us, and where people writing back to us and saying, "Wow, this language doesn't exist." And what we're finding is that with some languages, they're referred to maybe 30 different ways, 40 different ways. In Australia, some First Nation languages have got more than 50 different spellings. So we're trying to really start to build this into this platform, but also the beauty of living today is that there's immense computing power that we have access to that allows us to really be able to do this work, which you couldn't do even 3 years ago. So this is how much technology is changing. It's changing so fast that now we can start to take this deep dive approach and then begin to see that every single human being has their own, I don't want to use the word fingerprint, but no two humans are alike, because when you start to look at the identities that make up one human being, they are so multifaceted, and that's the beauty. So how do we start to draw upon this, How do organizations begin to use this to, give them that competitive edge?
Thanks, Peter. Any other questions, comments?
You have a couple in the chat. Davina asked the questions, Peter, what are your thoughts for neuroplasticity to tackle racism?
Could you repeat that again? What?
And I might ask Davina to kind of flesh that one out for us, but she says, what are your thoughts re neuroplasticity to tackle racism?
Neuroplasticity. I'm sorry, I can't speak to that because I'm going to probably have to defer that to another time and maybe give you my email and then maybe come back to that one with an answer at a later date. Neuroplasticity. I'm just trying to think of neuroplasticity in the context of what we're talking about.
I think Katrina then expounds upon that and asks, can we rewire our responses around race?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I got the question now. I don't know. I was thinking about this all weekend. I was thinking about, I think there's going to be there needs to be almost a sort of monumental shift that's going to need to take place for us to deal with racism, because it really does stem from fear, and fear has been around since day dot. Human beings were always on the lookout. Was it going to be a lion around the corner, or a hyena, or an enemy? It's interesting how all this plays out today through a whole range of microaggressions and unconscious biases too. That it all feeds into racism and fear. So I don't know what the answer is. I think some human being might come around in the next few decades or in the future and create this massive disruption that allows us to eliminate racism. I ultimately think the answer lies in education. Okay, what other questions do we have?
There's one here from that talks to the corporate perspective, and if you look at cultural diversity on many different dimensions, how are you identifying your underrepresented or marginalized groups? And are you creating equity? And who are you creating equity for? So I guess in part, if you only look at a slice of the organization, you can create equity within that, but you're not necessarily going to capture everyone. What you described, Peter, is we have to have this self-identification, so we've got the broadest possible brush.
That's right.
It becomes a bit of a challenge, though. How do we digest that broadest possible brush? And the human condition is to dumb stuff down, to simplify into manageable chunks. And we run the risk then as we start, I suspect, creating equity for, again, back to big groups, big pockets, and we lose sight of that individuality. So, how do we manage for that?
What we've noticed is when we take this data-driven approach, and it allows us to look at the myriad of combinations, you start to see these statistical insights. And the larger the data set, the more insights that you begin to see, and then you can develop strategies. Yes, it's going to be impossible to be able to develop a strategy to cater for the needs of every single person. So this is why I think it's really important that organizations go beyond data and they start to really develop programs around cultural safety, psychological safety in organizations. But we need to start with the conversation initially, and taking this intersectional approach is going to allow us to really see the myriad of combinations and possibilities, and to develop long-term strategies to deal with everything that's going on. But I'm starting to think of what happened during the pandemic and how blanket strategies began to have this disproportionate impact on communities. In my city, Melbourne, if you were of Greek ethnicity, the chances of dying of COVID were 10 times greater than any other Melburnian. Why was that the case? So, and that's because blanket approaches don't work. We need to start to look at the relationship between, in terms of with COVID, is there's a strong relationship between health and ethnicity. There's a strong relationship between how people receive the messages. Translations that were carried out weren't carried out effectively. Our governments made the assumption that if you came from Myanmar, you just spoke Burmese. But hang on, there are 110 languages spoken in Myanmar, and not everyone speaks this language. So we're not all in this together. And and we need to move beyond it now. I don't think we're going to get to a point where we can cater for everyone, but we can certainly go a lot further. And we need to stop making these broad statements that we're all in this together, because that assumes that we're all starting from the same place, not only socially, but also culturally as well. I hope I've somewhat answered that question. And I think it's a great question. There's a bit more there on neuroplasticity. If you, I think with neuroplasticity, if you look at the approach Netflix are taking to having really diverse and non-stereotypical representation, they are not there yet. However, I suspect the experience of younger folk growing up in more current Netflix world will have different assumptions to those I grew up with. I totally agree with you, Katrina. However, I still don't think they're taking a data-driven approach which ensures that no one is left out. And that's why you need to have comprehensive data sets that include everyone.
And perhaps, to that observation, it's more about a generational evolution, not necessarily a reprogramming of the existing generation. So it is a progression of time, and that earlier comment you made about the cultural progression that we will experience inevitably over years.
Yeah, I think there's also the danger that, we don't want to be losing the beauty of humanity, and that's, the myriad of, cultures that make up humanity. So we don't want to be watering down every single culture. There's beauty in every single culture. There's beauty in every single language. We know that, there are some 7,000 languages that are spoken today, and in the next, 80 years, there'll be less than probably 1,000 according to linguists. Think of the impact that will have on humanity. Think of the impact of the value-based systems and knowledge that will be lost with those 6,000 languages disappearing. So I think we need to do more to foster and value and celebrate cultural diversity.
Terrific. Well, I think that brings us to time, Peter. So thank you very much for that. I think as we transition out, Janelle, do you want to just pop that end of session survey up for folks? If we could get your feedback on the conversations we're having today, it will certainly help us tune into what's important to you, and also there's the poll up on your screen. If you could just all have a click through that, that would be excellent feedback for us to work with. I invite you to rejoin us if you are at 2 p.m. Hong Kong time to meet with Tala Mohammed. Tala is going to share with us the lived experience of being a Pakistani in Hong Kong and the experience of racism. It will make it much more tangible for you that if you don't really know what it's like to walk in shoes, then he will have a great story to share. So in wrapping up, I'd like to say thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate your time and what you've given us today out of your day, and the thinking that you've done over the weekend, obviously. And as you convalesce from something that took your family out for the weekend. So I hope you're all bouncing back and well. To deal with the fear, to come with an intersectional approach, to not be boxing folks up. I think these are the sorts of things that lead to people being seen for who they are, and that was the message that you were trying to share. So a definitive statement around race and racism is perhaps not as helpful as the antithesis is what do we want to create in its place, and be a little bit positive around the aspiration instead. So I thank you for your time today. I thank you for everyone's participation. If you've got questions, drop them on the Miro board if you can. We can certainly bounce them back off Peter if he hasn't had a chance to respond to them. And I thank you all very much.
Please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email there, or reach out to Andrew. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me. This happened really quickly, and I really enjoyed it today, and I enjoyed spending the weekend thinking about race and racism and how it intersects with the work that all of us are doing, and ultimately trying to make our settings better. And if our settings are better, then that flows out into the communities. Thank you.
Yep. Just quickly drawn to the attention in the margins there. People are free to leave. So Lauren just said someone has a question. I'm wondering if it's the one above, Rule, about having seen effective impact on corporates or otherwise. Not entirely sure if Rule, are you still on the call?
Yes, I'm still on the call. So Peter, I can send an email, or if you can share any insight.
Well, I can answer that very quickly. We did a whole lot of work with an organization called Health West, and Health West, they developed the workforce mutuality standards. And so there's groups of hospitals that we're now working with who are beginning to work to make their organizations more reflective of the communities they're serving, because what they're noticing is that when they have a workforce that's reflective of the community, there are better health outcomes. People spend less time in hospital. The private hospitals, that's a group of private hospitals we're working with at the moment, they're saying we're becoming more profitable because of this work as well, because people see us, in the other. People want to be seen in the other. I mean, this is incredibly important. And recently there was a study which was featured in The Guardian, which showed that something like the chances of dying on an operating table if you're a woman and the surgery was performed by a man is 32% greater than if it was performed by a woman. So that's just a little bit of trivia, but I think some hospitals are starting to lead the way here. There's some multinational companies that we're working with, which I can't really speak about at the moment, who want to make a difference in this space. They also recognize how incredibly complex this area of work is, especially when you have an organization that's growing at an astronomical rate. So how does it, really begin to start to think of its, workforce as being its greatest asset? Because what organizations do is they spend an incredible amount of money understanding their communities. Some of these organizations know what, what the consumers are going to buy before the consumer has worked out. Yet they haven't worked out who they are yet. So I think this is the work that we need to do, and some organizations are recognizing that. Thank you.
That's a neat segue to the second and last session on day 3, where we'll be talking about self-identification and data. So thanks for that, Peter. All right. On that note, I think we'll conclude and see you very soon